watch out, that your skin can bring you so much pain. Now I hear you say, you got the best of both ways. Won't you come and take a walk in my shoes and tell me if you take my place? Under cover of my skin, I've heard all your names. If it's all the same, I'll keep on walking. Under cover of my skin, I've heard all your names. If it's all the same, I'll keep on walking.
Okay, I'm here with Alan McCubbin and Steph Gaskell. They are both accredited sports dietitians from Monash University. You've probably heard Steph's name before because she helped me when I was preparing for the World Championships Marathon in Doha. And Alan, he's also been a guest on our show before. Is that right, Alan?
Yeah, a couple of times now.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Welcome, Steph.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yep. Why do they call you sub 2 hours, Steph?
I don't know. The boys were mucking around, and then I made up this story about shoes and me running a sub 2 hour marathon, and so now I've got my name sub 2 hour.
Oh, you made a claim.
Yep.
All right. Now, Alan and Steph are here to chat about heat and, in particular, training and performing in the heat. Alan, I'll let you introduce what you're here to chat about today.
Yeah, sure. So obviously there's a big focus at the moment. Obviously we're coming into summer in Australia, so big component of what it takes to train and perform well in the heat. But thinking ahead, obviously we've got the Tokyo Olympics next year, and that's been a big focus, although that's kind of taken the edge off a bit, moving the marathon north to Sapporo, which was announced a month or so ago. And then obviously recently we had yourself over in Doha for the World Champs. So there's been a lot of focus in the last sort of 6 to 12 months on this issue of performing in the heat. So because of that, Sports Dietitians Australia had their recent conference in October, and that was the topic for that entire conference. And as a result of that, they've actually produced a position statement which sort of covers everything you want to know really about nutrition for training and competition in the heat, and that's going to be out available in January in the International Journal of Sport Nutrition, Exercise, Metabolism. But the good news is that sounds big and scary and academic, but there's no. This will be an open access paper, so you won't have to pay to access it, so anyone in the world can download it. And it's also written in. It's a pretty easy read compared to a lot of academic papers, and it's quite practical. So it does go through some theoretical stuff at the start, but there's a lot of practical stuff in there, including a massive long table of all sort of the practical recommendations.
And so who was this aimed at? So this paper was produced for the benefit of everybody, or was it produced like under direction from Athletics Australia or something like that?
No, so it was produced on behalf of Sports Dietitians Australia, but that said, the target audience of the paper is not just sports dietitians. It's really, exercise physiologists, coaches, trainers, and even potentially athletes themselves. Really, anyone who's interested in the science of performing in the heat and what you can do from a nutrition perspective to improve that.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. Sounds relevant. It's getting hot now. Yeah. We're all wondering what we should do. How many shots, tablets we should put in our drink bottle.
That's the one.
So I guess we'll start with something pretty basic and maybe an underlying concept. How does heat affect performance?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a really relevant one because it really depends on what sort of performance you're talking about. So there's some data was collected, it was quite a few years ago now, but they sort of compared times in athletics championship events from very hot events to very cool events, and what you generally find is that the sprint events actually you perform better in the heat. So the 100, the 200, and possibly even the 400, you tend to perform better in a hot environment. The middle distance events, sort of 1800 up to about 5k, definitely 18 and 1500. Generally, there's not much difference, and once you start to get up to sort of 5 to 10k plus, then generally you perform worse in the heat because obviously you're producing all this body heat that your body's got to get rid of, and that becomes a challenge once you start generating that heat over a prolonged period of time.
So why does it improve in performance in short distance running?
It's to do with the temperature of your muscles, essentially. So if you think about, sprinters will always warm up before they run, or most people will warm up before they exercise, and you're trying to warm up the muscle. In a hot environment, the muscle's already warmer than it would be in a cooler environment, and that basically facilitates all the biochemical bits and pieces and all the contractions and things that go on at sort of the muscle fiber level that help you essentially produce power.
So what are we talking about, 5 minutes? Is that about the time before it starts to worsen?
It seems to be. So the analysis they did suggests that, everything up to 400 metre tends to be better. 1800 and 1500 are pretty similar. 5K maybe fractionally worse, and then sort of 10K onwards starts to get worse. So, yeah, it's probably around that kind of 15-minute mark, I suppose.
Yeah, okay. Is there a specific temperature when it starts to affect, or how do we rate like the threshold where heat becomes a problem for us?
Yeah, that's kind of a $1 million question, and we had a great presentation actually at the conference on this from Ollie J, who's a researcher up in Sydney, and he's done a whole lot of work in this area looking at the effects of temperature versus the effects of humidity and airflow and all of these things. And we were talking off air before the fact that today it's about 27, 28 degrees in Melbourne, but it's a dry 27, 28 degrees. It's not very humid. Whereas if you went up to Cairns and it was 27 or 28 degrees, you'd really feel the difference in terms of how you're working. And that's a really important point, is that we can't just look at a weather forecast at the degrees Celsius and say that's the effect it's going to have on us, because the humidity greatly impacts on how much our sweat can evaporate, and that has an impact on how effective that sweat is at keeping us cool. Things like airflow, so just how windy it is on the day, will have an effect as well. Not so much relevant to running, but in other sports, how much clothing and protective equipment you have to wear, all of those things will play into it. So you can't really just have a number and say, above this degrees it's a problem, because there's all of these factors going into it. And what Ollie's team do is actually have an algorithm, and it's custom built for different sports, where they plug all of these values into it and create what they call a heat stress index. And they've created that. If anyone watches the Australian Tennis Open, you might have seen the heat stress index, and at times they've closed the roof because of it, or stopped play on the outside courts because of it, or taken extra drink breaks and so on. So there's a fair bit that goes into it from a physiology perspective, rather than just saying this is the number.
So Steph, you watched the women's marathon in Doha. Where does that rate on the stress index? Did anyone put that in the calculator?
Did they, Alan? I don't think they did.
I don't think Ollie's created a stress index calendar specifically for running. I'm not sure if other people have. But yeah, the fact that there wasn't blazing sun shining down would have helped. But then obviously it was hot, and was it more humid for the women's race?
So
it was
humid. Yeah, they got the worst of it.
Yeah, so that makes a big difference.
Yeah, because that was one of the big differences between the men's race and the women's race, is the temperature wasn't a big difference, but I think we had the humidity was hugely different.
Yeah. And basically when you sweat, the way it cools you down is by evaporating off your skin, and it does that by having a difference between the humidity of the air and the humidity on your skin. And so if that difference isn't as great because the air is very humid, then you don't get as much evaporation, and you don't get the same cooling effect from the sweat that you do produce. So it tends to just bead up on your skin and stay there. And anyone running in a sort of a tropical environment would appreciate that compared to running in a dry environment.
And I had a lot of people actually concerned about my health during the week leading in, because the media got hold of it and they're putting up images of people passing out, that kind of thing. So there were actually family members saying, "Hey, is this safe for you to do this?" What are the health risks, or the real dangers with running in the heat like this?
Yeah, it's a bit of a continuum, and there's kind of three sort of main medical conditions that are kind of described. You've got sort of exertional heat illness at the lower end of the spectrum, and that can be, as you're you exercise and your body heats up, you tend to dilate your blood vessels so they get bigger. And that's well and good, but what tends to happen is your blood pressure starts to fall. You rely on your calf muscles contracting to pump blood back up from your feet back towards your circulation, back to your heart. And so what can happen is if you suddenly stop running, you can, you have that blood pooling at your feet and you can actually faint because of it. It's called heat syncope. And that can happen, anything around sort of 38.5 up to, 40 degrees. Body temperature, that is, not air temperature. And then as you sort of go through that continuum, you can start to get, damage to organs, but you need a more sort of sustained, probably 39.5 plus degree temperature, for a period of time for that to occur. And Steph can talk about some of the gastrointestinal implications of that as well. And then at the extreme end of the scale is what we call exertional heat stroke, which is usually, but not always, associated with a body temperature above 40. And that's where you get quite a range of issues happening in terms of affecting conscious state. People can get seizures and become unconscious. You can have organ failure and all sort of nasty stuff. Your gut barrier between what's inside your intestinal tract and the blood breaks down, and you get bits and pieces coming across into your blood and causing infections and all sorts of nasty stuff. And that's really a medical emergency. But that's very much the extreme end of the scale, and you don't see that very commonly. So
as a runner, does that, our body will not let us run any further to try to avoid this happening, right? So when we see Callum Hawkins falling over in the Com Games and everyone at Doha and the marathon, it's just basically, I saw it even in the walks events, people just falling over. Is that their body stopping them from putting themselves into more harm?
It could well be. I mean, unless you have, a rectal thermometer on hand at the time and a whole bunch of other medical kit, it's hard to say exactly what's going on, just watching it on TV. But, that would be probably towards the sort of the mild to moderate end of that spectrum. Exertional heat stroke, as I said, is pretty rare. And it's a life-threatening condition that requires immediate cooling. But as I said, it doesn't actually happen that often in reality. There have been examples historically of where that's happened, and it has been associated with actually some banned substances over the years. So things like amphetamines actually sort of block that fatigue signal from a very high body temperature and allow you to push yourself too far. And there was an example of that in the Tour de France back in the 1960s. A guy from the UK who actually died on one of the big climbs there from thought from exertional heat stroke, and evidence of amphetamine use there.
Yeah. Does that happen at music festivals when they dance all day in the sun?
It could, and that is definitely a risk. It's the sort of things that you have to be careful about, all jokes aside, yeah.
Steph, sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, probably a lot of, athletes in that environment, in that heat, if we did have a rectal thermometer up their bum just to check their temp, the temperature probably is, and there has been some people recorded as getting it over, the 40 degrees or so. And even in the race walkers, there's already been some research in race walkers. And although some people would think, they probably can't get their temp up that high, they definitely do get it over, that sort of 39 degrees or so. And everyone's kind of got, a different ability to thermoregulate. And obviously it's also dependent on how well they acclimatise, etc., and what strategies they're putting in. But we know that when that body temperature gets to 39 degrees or so, that's where we can get, a reasonable amount of damage to the gut. And with the damage to the gut, we can also get the gut not functioning as well, which then will have an impact on how well we can, digest and break down food and absorb our nutrients that we're getting. And the longer duration events, then, the longer time we have to do more and more damage. So when we're thinking about, nutrition strategies for performing in the heat, we're also thinking about, how can we prevent or reduce the impact the heat has on the gut as well? Because that also will impact on your performance.
Yeah, because when you drew up my strategy for the marathon, it was much less than what I would normally take. And you mentioned it was due to the temperature. It was going to affect how I could absorb it. So I might be able to take it on, but it wouldn't get used properly. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's so in terms of your during race nutrition strategy, it's like with carb intake, and like you always see on gels or on products how they say, okay, like the standard recommendation might be have a gel within 45 minutes or so. That's like just this kind of blanket recommendation, which it's not individualized, and so each person obviously has a different ability to break down the carbs and oxidize it, which is going to vary depending on people's diet, on their fitness level, etc. And then also carb intake, we also need to consider how much we recommend someone depending on their environment. So, when you're in a hot condition compared to cooler, generally in the cooler condition, you should be able to tolerate, more carbohydrate, because also we've got less risk of being more dehydrated, I guess, as well. Mm-hmm. Less impact on the gut as well. It's also going to vary in terms of when we're racing or training at altitude. That also will influence our carb intake. So for you, that's where like you typically we're getting in, like you get in a reasonable amount of carb per hour, which is fantastic. But I was also just thinking, okay, like I also just want to think about minimizing any risk for you as well. So that's why I kind of we looked at increasing your carb intake, particularly leading in the couple of days leading in, to take advantage of making sure you're entering into that race kind of, super saturated with carbs in your muscles. So that then it wasn't too much of an issue if we did need to dial down. And we also did that sort of pre-carb, bolus before you started racing. Yeah. But you ended up doing an awesome job and being able to tolerate. I think, we worked out roughly maybe around sort of towards the 80, maybe 70 to 80 grams of carbs an hour, just because I guess also we had that ability of having those frequent aid stations as well.
That's right.
And the important thing from the gut perspective for me, and from what we know in research, is we want to not overwhelm your gut. So small frequent intake is really good, because it's easier for your gut to kind of take on, but then it also helps with, I guess, promoting blood flow in a way to the gut as well, which is another thing that we want to do. So so I guess that's kind of, we can always have sort of this guideline, and but then it's, when you come to race day, at least you know what you can kind of work between.
Yeah, and I think we'll do another episode on the guidelines for normal conditions, and we'll talk about that carb load more. It sounds a lot better than it actually is. Everyone's thinking that sounds fantastic, but when you actually break down what foods you're eating and when that carb saturation, it's actually not that enjoyable.
Yeah.
So we'll chat about that in a different episode. But from this paper coming out, do you think it's going to change how people prepare for Tokyo than how they prepared for Doha? Is there anything kind of groundbreaking in it?
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think there's a couple of things that are not necessarily that new, but probably people haven't necessarily heard that much about. I was just going to backtrack one sec, and I was going to say one of the myths or misconceptions about heat would be that the longer the event is, the higher your body temperature gets, but often it's actually the reverse, because if you think about it, when you're running, say, a 10K or a half marathon, your pace is obviously higher, and your pace is the rate that essentially you're going to be contracting your muscles, producing energy, and that's the rate that you're producing heat at as well. So generally, if you measure someone's rectal temperature as they cross the finish line of a 10K or a half marathon, it's generally going to be higher than a marathon, and probably higher again than an ultra. So that's one side of the story, and the other part is how long you're exposed to that higher temperature. So, Steph mentioned the gut issues above 39, and what we tend to see is you have to be over 39 for at least a couple of hours to see that sort of breakdown issue occur. If you're at that for only an hour or so, it's much less of an issue. But coming back to sort of the novel stuff or what's new, I think there's a couple of areas. One is, we've sort of talked about hydration for years. I think we're in a stage now in hydration research where that's becoming a bit more practical, hopefully, and I think people are sort of hopefully coming in from the two extremes. There's always been this debate in hydration for years about, how much you should drink and whether you should drink to thirst or you should drink to a plan and that sort of thing. And I think we're slowly starting to come towards a bit of a consensus. I don't think we're there yet, but we're getting there. I think some of the pre-exercise hydration stuff, which you guys can maybe talk about, what happened for you in Doha in terms of the sodium loading and so on. Some of the other stuff that's been around since probably the Beijing Olympics is the pre-cooling, like using ice slushies and stuff before exercise, but it's still something that not everyone knows about necessarily. But probably the newer areas, one is the use of glycerol to rather than sodium to hyperhydrate or overhydrate prior to exercise. And glycerol was something that was actually banned by WADA, I think it was about 2010 or 2011 from memory. And so a lot of the research in that area kind of stopped. And the reason it was banned is they thought it could be a masking agent for other substances. So not that it was a problem in itself. But they, did some follow-up research and realised that actually, no, it wasn't a problem. So that was then taken off the banned substances list only about 18 months ago. So we may see a big use of glycerol again come Tokyo. And then the final area is an interesting one, and it's not changing your body temperature at all, but changing your perception of body temperature using menthol. So anyone who's had like Fisherman's Friends or any of those sort of lollies that have a lot of menthol in them, you get that sort of cooling feeling in your mouth when you have it. You can apply menthol gel on your skin and things like that, which also gives you a cooling sensation. So you can actually change your perception of heat without changing the actual body temperature that you're running at.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it was interesting in Doha to see only maybe 4 countries pre-cooling, like using ice bath out of everybody, and they're the ones that sort of had the physiologists working for them, maybe. I watched an African team run for like 15 minutes beforehand in full tracksuits, which is kind of doing the opposite of what they would, what you guys would sort of suggest for them to do. But they weren't the ones that actually did that well though, so that was interesting.
And certainly listening to a couple of the race walkers in Doha that did quite well, and they were saying all the media and people were complaining about the heat and and he's saying, well, we all knew it was going to be hot. Like, if you're not prepared for that, you just haven't done your homework. Like, there's all these strategies out there, with possibly the exception of menthol. None of them are particularly new. They just haven't been taken up by a lot of people. Yeah.
I think the Australians with Brent Valance, you guys probably know Brent. He was actually experimenting with glycerol. I think there was a study being done, glycerol loading before the run. You, Steph, you had me take on about 2,500 milligrams of sodium 2 hours before the run.
Yep. And I guess, so Alan's the expert in anything sort of sodium and I guess hydration-wise, but I knew that, he'd just recently completed his PhD in the area. So, whenever I do a nutrition plan for something like this, I'm always, trying to get other people's input as well where I know they're researching. So this was something Alan had mentioned to me. So I knew it wouldn't taste great. So that's why I wanted you to, do a bit of trialing with it. But it's basically, I guess, Alan can add in a lot more here, but it's to help with your thermoregulation. So it's to help, I guess, would you say, increase your plasma volume, which is just going to help reduce your overall sort of thermal strain. Alan? Yeah,
pretty much. So, I guess the idea behind the sodium loading is you're trying to get more hydrated, so get more water into the body. But if you just drink plain water, one of two things is going to happen. You're either just going to pee it straight out again, and you really haven't achieved anything, and it's been inconvenient to you, or in some exercise situations, it's like when you're over drinking, you can have all that water move into the cells and cause hyponatremia, or the symptoms of hyponatremia, which is sort of a dangerous medical condition, which you don't want that either. So the purpose of adding the sodium to the water is that you're trying to get that mixture of water and sodium so it's retained. Exactly right. So you're trying to get the concentration of sodium within that water about the same as what the concentration of sodium is in your blood, and then the body will keep it in that fluid compartment of the body, not pee as much of it out, and not shunt it on inside the cells. And so the idea is by keeping that extra water, you can tolerate obviously a greater degree of fluid loss before you're quote unquote dehydrated. And as Steph said, if you've got more water in your body, it's just basic physics. It takes more heat to heat the body up.
So we're coming into a warm season. If I wake up in the morning, I go and have a wee, and I've got really dark urine, should I be drinking water before my run, or should I have an electrolyte straight away? Electrolyte tablet with my drink, or a Gatorade or something like that?
That's a very good question. The problem with urine colour is it's not always very reliable to assess hydration status. So if you've done a big run the day before, for example, then your urine's probably a pretty unreliable indicator of what's going on. But that said, if you're well rested and you haven't done anything the day before, or you just had an easy run in the morning or something, and it's full 24 hours later, then it's probably okay.
Which would not be Julian. He would have done a double run, I'm sure.
Oh,
there you
not
go.
Lately. It's more like the beer related darkness.
So I think one of the difficulties with interpreting urine is that people assume that urine's a reflection of what's going on in the body, whereas urine is really what the kidneys are trying to do to keep the body in balance, if that makes sense. And so just because you've got dark urine doesn't necessarily mean that you're dehydrated. It can in a lot of situations, but there are examples, like during heat acclimation, for example, you're always going to have dark urine because your body's retaining more water, and so it's not peeing it out. It doesn't mean you're more dehydrated. In fact, you're becoming progressively better hydrated, but it doesn't necessarily mean you'll have clear pee. Urine's an interesting one. It's it's been used for decades. It's cheap. It's easy to do. Anyone can do it. But there are a few caveats in terms of using urine colour, or even some of the more sophisticated measures, urine-specific gravity and stuff that some clinicians might use. As still, you have to interpret it with caution.
So, how much, in terms of hydrating during the day, for instance, if I'm at work during the day, I have a training session 5 p.m. after work, should I be drinking pure water from a drink bottle? Should I be using electrolytes? Does this depend on my diet? Because this is a very confusing topic.
Yeah. So we talk about this in the consensus statement or position statement. For example, post-exercise, there's been some great work done at Griffith University up in Queensland that's shown basically you can just drink normal water as long as you're having food with that, like your normal meal or something within an hour or two of exercise. Then the effect of having water is not going to be any different from having electrolytes or milk or anything else. So it really depends on the context of, what else you're having with the fluid and when your next session is and how quickly you need to rehydrate from one session to the next. If you need to rehydrate within, a matter of a couple of hours, then probably, yes, having something with some electrolytes in it will be beneficial. But if you're talking, 12 hours or 15 hours or something, and you're going to have, your normal meals and snacks and stuff in there, then probably the choice of drink doesn't make any difference.
Okay, interesting. Now, we also discussed, Steph and I, how much sodium should I take during the run?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've done a PhD in sodium and endurance athletes, and I don't feel I'm much closer to answering that question as well. It's an interesting one, and traditionally, you can take sweat samples, and I did a huge amount of that during my research in terms of working out how much sodium individuals are losing. The question is, once you know how much someone's losing, how much of that should you replace? Should you replace 100% of that, 50% of that, none? Does it matter? I'd suggest probably my thinking sort of gone around in loops and circles and tied itself in knots over the years. But I think where I've sort of come to is it's not so much about trying to match a certain percentage of your sodium loss. It's actually trying to balance the sodium that you're consuming with the water you're consuming. So you're not, having too much sodium relative to water or too much water relative to sodium, because either of those things are going to upset the balance in terms of fluid between the fluid inside your cells and the fluid on the outside in terms of in your blood and surrounding your cells. And so if you have just pure water, particularly over a long period of time, and particularly if you drink too much of it, it's going to move towards the inside of your cells. But on the other hand, if you have bucket loads of sodium, like you're just downing salt capsules and stuff and actually not drinking that much, the reverse is going to happen. The water's going to be pulled out of your cells. And neither of those things are probably a desirable outcome. So my suggestion now is that, if you know that you're a saltier sweater in terms of you had that measured, then probably you need to be at the higher end. But if you don't lose that much sodium in your sweat, then you can be at the lower end. But even the measurement of sweat sodium is not a very precise thing. So, and it varies so much in different scenarios, different weather conditions, different pace, different body temperatures, all that kind of stuff. So I guess my practical take home from there is that if you're going to measure sweat sodium content and you get your number, might be 60 millimole per litre or whatever it is, it's not a definite number. So you're not saying I'm a 60 person and this person's a 40 person. It's more, I'm probably at the higher end of normal and that person's, somewhere in the middle or at the lower end or whatever. And so I need to be a bit more conscious about it. But I don't think we're any closer to really saying this is exactly what you need to do. And as I said, it's so variable from day to day that will be almost impossible anyway.
Yeah, no, I don't think any listener knows what to do now.
Yeah, I know. And also practitioners, right?
Yeah.
We love just a nice, simple guide. But, I think, again, like just where it is so individual and, it depends on the environment, the fitness, how acclimatized a person is, etc. as well too, Alan.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all of those things will make a difference. So basically your sweat sodium concentration increases with sweat rate. So anything that makes your sweat rate higher, whether it's you're running faster, the weather's hotter or more humid, there's less airflow, like running indoors on a treadmill compared to outdoors, any of those things will increase the sweat sodium concentration. And it doesn't mean it's an emergency. You need to panic. That's just the effect that it has. So I guess, I think from a practical perspective, if you do get your sodium measured, you sort of just need to know, am I at the higher, the middle or the lower end, and then kind of adjust the sodium in what you're drinking with the help of someone who can help you plan that to, roughly match what you're doing, but realize that you're never going to get it exactly right on any given day. So as long as you're in the ballpark, that's probably fine. And the reason I tend to like matching the sodium concentration of your fluid to the sweat sodium concentration is that it's scalable. So if you drink 100% of your fluid losses, well, you're still matching the sodium to the fluid. Or if you only drink 20% of your fluid losses, you're still matching it, because as the volume of drink goes up and down, the amount of sodium goes up and down with it in proportion.
How am I going to know mid-race, say I do a 100K ultra, how am I going to know whether I need more sodium or whether I need more water? What's going to be the signs that tell me that?
Very difficult to answer that. There's not really any good ones, to be honest. People talk about, getting a salt crust on my skin must mean that I'm losing a lot of sweat, losing a lot of salt in my sweat. Well, yes, but that can accumulate over hours anyway, even if you're not a very salty sweater. And if you're wearing dark-coloured clothing, you're more likely to see it than if you're wearing white clothing. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that's a very reliable indicator. This is one of the arguments that people are having in the sort of drink to thirst versus drink to a plan debate, is saying, well, if I drink to a plan and it's 20% off on any given day, by the time I'm up to 8-10 hours in, you go 10% off per hour over 10 hours, all of a sudden that's a huge discrepancy between what I'm losing and what I'm drinking. And I tend to agree with that. I think in those sort of longer events that you kind of have to use thirst as a guide to some extent, because there's not much else you can use. If you do pee, urine's going to be very unreliable during exercise, so I wouldn't trust that. As I said, salt on your skin's not going to be reliable. Pretty much the only thing that we can do, short of stopping, taking a blood test and waiting 10 minutes is thirst. It's really the only feedback mechanism that we're going to have.
Sodium intake and cramping. That's one that everyone loves talking about.
Oh, yeah.
So where do we fall on that one, professionals?
It's another interesting area. 5 years ago, the general consensus had come to sodium's got nothing to do with cramping. It's all about muscle fatigue, that kind of thing. Sort of the research in this area goes back to like miners in the 1920s and 30s. But just this year, actually, there's been a couple of papers published that suggest that the issue is not necessarily a loss of sodium during exercise or dehydration per se. It's one thing that may increase your risk of cramping is actually suddenly diluting the sodium in your blood very quickly. So if you become dehydrated during exercise, what tends to happen is you're losing more water than you're losing sodium. So the blood sodium concentration actually goes up as you become dehydrated by definition. And no matter how salty your sweat is, that will always happen. But if you're quite dehydrated and then you suddenly scull a lot of plain water, that seems to be one of the things that is going to increase your risk of cramping. And so you can see this during exercise, but you often see this after a race. People stop running, they'll relax, they go, have a bit of water because they're thirsty, and all of a sudden, half an hour later, they start cramping, even though the race is already finished.
Steph, so I told you during my, when I wrote out my plan and everything, that I would drink beer most nights. Now, as it gets hotter, is that getting worse for me, or is it okay to continue with a few beers after a training session? Or what effect does heat have on alcohol and hydration?
Alcohol has a bit of that diuretic effect, but I would say focus on getting in some rehydrating quite well. So at dinner you might have a bit of water with your food and stuff, so you've got your electrolytes from food, carbs from food, which will help retain the fluid that you're drinking, and you can definitely have some beers, but just make sure you also have some of the water coming in. It's got to be practical and sociable and something that you enjoy as well. Would you want to add to that, Alan?
I was going to say that the guys up in Queensland that we were talking about before that did the post-exercise rehydration stuff, they've done a lot of work in beer and post-exercise hydration, and they've all done all sorts of weird stuff like adding salt to beer to see what effect it has and all kinds of stuff.
And percentage of alcohol as well, I think?
Yeah, so generally less than about 4% alcohol, you don't get much of a diuretic effect at all. So, maybe in the hot weather you just go to lighter beers and drink more of them.
Okay.
Might be the way to go. Or drink the same amount, but just the lighter beers. But yeah, they added salt to it, and apparently in a small amount it was okay, but once they started adding a lot, it tasted bloody horrible, and they had beers exploding and all kinds of fun stuff that you do when you get to do beer research.
It's a good way to stop you from drinking the beer, telling someone they have to put a spoonful of salt in.
Exactly.
All right. Now, Steph, is there anything, if, say, for instance, Ali goes and runs the marathon in Tokyo, is there anything that you would do different in how you prepared her for the heat on the day than how you prepared me?
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, you're both very different in terms of different body mass. I don't know what Ellie's been doing sort of nutrition wise and carb intake and gut training wise and fluid tolerance and gut symptoms. So there's always these kind of key factors that we're looking at in terms of fluid, carbohydrate intake, like what Alan said, menthol, all of those types of things. But then we need to key it in to that specific individual. And then I'd also for you, we also looked at that lead-in diet. A big thing for me for your race for Doha, we backed off of too much sort of, bulk and residue because you were racing at midnight. Yes. So you've obviously got all this kind of gastric load coming into then you're putting a big demand on your gut when you're racing, compared to, if we're racing, in the morning, you kind of have that bigger time to fast. So, for you, we sort of focused on really making sure we kind of got all that timing and stuff right for Ellie for Tokyo. We'd have a look at when her race start was. I would implement in the heat for someone. I would still look at reducing the total FODMAP intake, just because, like my study showed last year, which just got published, that a higher FODMAP intake can increase our severity of symptoms and the risk. So I still think it's not too difficult to change, and if I can just minimise risk where I'm able to, that's something I'd definitely put in.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the only other thing I'd add to that is just coming back sort of full circle to the start where we talked about, the temperature versus humidity and other factors. In dry heat, sweat is obviously much more effective at cooling you down. So the focus there should be really on, making sure that, you're sweating well. So heat acclimation obviously is really important. Getting enough fluid in, but even like pouring water over yourself, because that's going to evaporate off and it's almost like free sweat, if you like. Whereas in a very humid environment, sweat is much less effective at cooling you down. So some of those other strategies in terms of the slushies and the cold drinks and the pre-cooling and the pre-exercise hyperhydration, because you're going to sweat more in a humid environment, they all become more important in that sort of environment.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So, because I could never explain why I just got this sudden burst of energy every time, like from way back, like when I was a kid, of when you get like water squirted over your head, or for instance, if you're it's a really hot day and you go and swim and you dive under the water, or you go surfing or something like that, it's like, it just gives you this incredible rush. Yeah, and it feels like that when you run a marathon and you dump some water over your head.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's just that evaporative effect.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks to you both for coming on today. When will this paper be released?
January is the plan. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So all the coaches will get it in time before Tokyo.
Yes. Although I guess all the marathon coaches probably don't need to read it now. It's moved up to Sapporo.
Well, it's still going to be kind of warm though.
Yeah, I haven't really looked at what the expected temperature is there. I just know people have been saying it's going to be a lot less of an issue than it was in Tokyo itself.
Less humid, sort of still high 20s temperature.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it would be silly to ignore doing heat work by the sounds of it, and taking all that on board.
Yeah, and just like here, it could be a freak day where it's really humid in other parts of the country where it normally isn't.
Yeah.
Or, it could be the opposite. I remember in Beijing, a lot of people prepared for heat for the Beijing Olympics, and then like the cycling road race, it turned out to be like 18 degrees and pouring with rain all afternoon. But, that happens. You have all these scientists and stuff that spend 2.5 years preparing for this stuff, and it all turns out to be rubbish on the day because Mother Nature takes a different turn.
Yeah. Well, we can only hope for super hot, terrible conditions again, just because that seems to be when the Australians perform pretty well.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. We will catch up with you guys again for that more generic chat about sort of race day nutrition and tapering, carb loading, because I think that's a really good one.
Yeah. Awesome. Right. Sounds good.
Thanks, guys.
Cool. All right, cheers. No worries.
Welcome to a special edition of the Inside Running podcast. We have a couple of nutrition experts, sports dietitians joining us today, Steph Gaskell and Alan McCubbin. Welcome back, guys. You've done it before here. You're doing it again.
I was going to say it's been a while, probably a couple of years, I reckon, since we were on the podcast.
Yeah, you popped up in my Skype contact list, so I know we did it. But I can't fully remember it, but I know we did it.
Yeah.
And then we've been lucky enough to have you on our podcast too, Jules.
That's right, and I did sort of leave that out. But you guys are hosting the Long Munch, which just celebrates. Was it 1 year of recording and posting?
Yeah, 1 year and the 50th episode in the same week.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And I actually listened. Well, I listened to the interview that you guys did for that, and it was brilliant. So, firstly, just we'll talk a little bit about it. You guys had Andy Jones on from the Breaking 2 project, the very first one, 2017.
Yeah.
Sub 2 hour marathon. Now, how did you get Andy? Who was it that hooked that up?
I think you contacted him, Steph, but academics are pretty easy to find. If you Google them, usually it comes up to a nice university thing, and universities are very nice to hand out everyone's email addresses and make them public generally. So it's usually pretty easy to get in touch. But the academic community is a pretty small one. We don't necessarily all know each other straight away, but usually we know someone who knows each other, so there's always sort of mutual acquaintances. And everyone's very supportive of each other and very happy to help out. So, yeah, I mean, Andy's done quite a few podcasts. I think ours was a little bit different in terms of having a specific nutrition focus as opposed to more a physiology focus, which he's had on some of the other ones. But, yeah, he was happy to chat to, and he was lovely, and we had a great time.
Yeah, it was quite insightful because most of us have probably seen the documentary, and to hear from somebody who was behind the scenes is pretty cool. We had Collis, who was one of the pacers, lives in Ballarat, and so he gave us a bit of an insight from the athlete perspective as well, which was fun. He did that on a live podcast down in Ballarat. Steph, what was the most interesting takeaway that you had from the interview you did with Andy about the project?
Yeah, I think for me it was more so just in terms of they intervened with nutrition with all of the athletes, but they didn't kind of overstep their mark either. Like they appreciated that, hey, these guys are doing something right. Like they've been running bloody fast, marathons for a long period of time. We already appreciate, the certain strengths in their nutrition, particularly with Kenyan runners. They have a really carbohydrate-rich diet, which we already know that's really good from a performance perspective. So they intervened, but they didn't overstep the mark. And then they also, got the athletes to make sure that they had time to practice what they were actually changing. And then what was really nice to see was the athletes like Kipchoge and the athletes actually took that on board and they did practice it. And then it was individualized too, so they didn't actually all have the same carbohydrate intake goal or fluid goal. And they refined that as they went.
Yeah. And Alan, anything sort of special that you picked up on?
Yeah, well, I'm a bit of a physiology nerd.
He is more physiology nerd than me, probably like you, Jules.
Yeah, so my pickup was more around the physiology side of things. And what's been really good, I think, out of this project is that both Andy and the Nike team more broadly have actually published quite a lot of the data from this. I mean, obviously it's de-identified, so you can't pick out who's Elliot and who's Zerzane in the data, but they tested 16 people as part of the selection process, and it's really interesting to see some of the results out of that. And we didn't touch on it a lot in the podcast. We did a little bit, but, as Andy said in the podcast, their VO2 maxes weren't actually that extraordinary, which you would assume that they would have to be. The average in the 16 people that they tested was only 71 mils per kilo per minute. And I think only one of them, when you look into the paper, was above 77. So, I mean, that's obviously high compared to the average punter, but for an elite athlete, you tend to think about, high 70s and maybe even into the 80s, and there was very few of those in that group. But what they were able to do to be able to sustain that kind of 21.1 k's an hour pace was having such amazing running economy. So they were able to, make the most out of the oxygen that they've got available to them to translate that into pure speed. Yeah. And secondly, they were able to sustain a pace that was equivalent of about 92% of their VO2 max, which is almost unheard of. So the fact that they could operate that close to their VO2 max and just maintain that for a long period of time without, a massive accumulation of lactate and all the fatigue and everything that goes along with that was pretty special. That said, of the 16 athletes they tested, only 7 were able to maintain a steady state at that 2-hour marathon pace. So clearly, the 3 that they chose would have been amongst those 7. And then the final thing that I really enjoyed was picking Andy's brains about how he could try and predict the finish times of the athletes. So I remember back in 2017, I was already following him on Twitter at that stage, and he would put out, sort of predictions of what he thought. And I think even in the documentary, you see him writing it on a little scrap of paper. He pulls it out the day after, and he was only out by about 18 or 20 seconds or something like that for Kipchoge. And he sort of ran through in the podcast that process of how he tries to calculate those times and predict them.
Yeah. I was wondering why they didn't select Kenenisa Bekele, considering you would consider that he has to be one of the most economical athletes given his track pedigree. I wonder if he was one of those 16 they tested.
Yeah, I don't know. And I guess there may have been some guys in the Nike stable that just weren't available at that time because they were focusing on other things as well, potentially.
Yeah. And one thing also, in order to be able to sort of be successful in an event like that, you need to be consistent and you need to be injury free. So if you've got someone breaking down every few months, not making start lines, that swingers, what do you call it? Swingers chance or whatever. It's not, it'd be hard to base a project on that. Which is kind of what Bekele's like. The long munch, one year down, that's pretty cool. Congrats on that. You've had some good guests. I'll listen.
Yeah.
So similar to the last question, what's the most interesting takeaway that you've had, Steph, over the course of that year?
There's been a lot. I've gotten something out of everyone, really. But I guess one of the things I guess that still gets me is how common we talk about, and recently, relative energy deficiency in sport, and just how common that is amongst athletes, and how I think that there needs to be more done in terms of how we can try and manage that better and prevent it from happening. And I think that perhaps needs to start happening more from a youth perspective. When we spoke to Izzy Bat-Doyle and just about her experience when she went to the US, and that culture, and just talking to a and interacting with a large number of athletes, and how much of an issue that is. And then when you can see the role that nutrition can play, when we do get it right. So, we've got big implications in terms of health and performance. But then when we actually tackle it and start to make sure the athlete is getting in enough energy for what they're doing, what a big change that can make to both the health and performance. So I think that's probably one of the most recent ones.
What about you, Alan? What's sort of been the biggest shock or surprise that you've come across, or the biggest lesson?
I think one of them was one of our most recent podcasts, again, around relative energy deficiency in sport. We had Sophie Mackay on, who's she's retired now. She was a cyclist who she went on what was then a kind of a notorious selection camp for an Australian women's development team at the AIS, and they sort of rode up Thredbo and they, sort of SAS style, wake them up in the middle of the night or suddenly get them off the bus and make them change a tyre randomly and in the freezing cold or something like that. And she got into a real hole. She was already struggling before that, but that kind of finished her off. And I was very lucky to work with her over the 12 months after that. And she sort of came back and won a national title not long after. But the thing that really struck me, and I don't think I really understood it at the time working with her, is that she was saying how much that sort of relative energy deficiency and that underfueling was impairing her ability to think through a race situation, like the tactical nous, the decision making, the ability to read a race and know when to go and when to hold back, and that tactical side of things. And she said, as she sort of recovered from the Reds and her performance started to improve. At the same time, she was able to improve her decision-making process in a race, and that culminated, 12 months later in winning the national criterium title. I think the other highlight for me was actually the episode we did around gastrointestinal issues. So Steph, in all our episodes, we have like an expert and then an athlete to provide their perspective. So Steph, obviously, that's her area of expertise, so she did that. But our guest athlete was a pro triathlete, Eniko Lanos, who started out with Olympic distance. He raced in Sydney and Athens Olympics, and then went into Ironman. I think finished second at the World Champs in Kona in the late 2000s. But he then ran into a whole big problem with gastrointestinal issues, and he actually had to fly out here to Australia, come to our clinic at Monash and do the full assessment to actually work out what the problem was, because it took him 2 or 3 years of trial and error, and he just couldn't figure out what the problem was. And eventually, through that the testing that he did in the lab, he was able to overcome that. And he describes that sort of the first race back, which was about maybe 3 months after he'd come down to Australia, and he was on the run leg of the Ironman. He just burst into tears because it was the first race he'd been able to do for, I think, almost 4 or 5 years. His career was on the line, that he was able to, get 10Ks into the run and not feel like he was going to have to pull out because of gut issues. And he actually broke down in tears on the podcast. It was quite incredible.
Yeah, wow. That's so head over. That sounds pretty familiar to Brett Robinson, actually, who is one of our marathoners who continually struggles with gut problems in the marathon. But so the Long Munch, check it out, listeners, because it is good. All right, so you guys are on here for a bit of a Q&A. So we reached out to our patrons to get a list of questions. And I'm just going to fire a few at you because I haven't structured them or ordered them. Now, I'm going to go from the top down. So first question we had was, what's the recommended ratio for the 3 major macros for an endurance athlete? Someone training. I'll just throw out. I know you guys love the it depends stuff. So I'm going to go and say someone who's running 100K a week, who runs 30K on Sundays, training for a marathon.
All right. Well, this one's easy because it doesn't depend.
Good. You love that.
Because the answer in this case is you don't use ratios at all in sports nutrition. So in general sort of population health, we talk about, what is the percentage of calories that come from fat versus protein versus carbs. We don't use those ratios at all in sports nutrition. And the reason is that we tend to describe our needs in grams per kilo of body weight per day usually, or sometimes even broken down on a per meal basis, particularly in the case of protein. And so I guess the way we tend to think of it is that your protein needs stay fairly consistent from day to day. There's a little bit of debate around this, but the general consensus is somewhere around 1.6 to 1.8 grams of protein per kilo of body weight. So multiply that by your body weight in kilos per day is about right. Now, there's a bit of nuance in terms of how you spread that out over the day, but as a general rule. Whereas your carbohydrate needs are going to go up and down depending on your training. So, depending on what sort of event you're training for, what your training schedule looks like, you might have some really big days and then some either really easy or complete rest days where you're not exercising at all. And so your carbohydrate is really your high intensity exercise fuel. So it makes sense that you need more of that leading into those hard sessions. Whereas on a day that's a complete rest day, your requirement for carbohydrate is almost nothing. So the carbs will go up and down depending on that. So it means that the ratio is going to be different if you actually calculate it. It's going to be different on each day of the week depending on your training schedule. So it's more about matching the carbs to the training than it is hitting these ratios.
And I'll quickly ask a question on that. So let's just use the example of this runner who on Saturday afternoon starts maybe fueling a little bit for his Sunday long run, ups his carb intake. Sunday afternoon after his long run, he will have to recover with a higher carb meal, won't he, or several high carb meals? When does the recovery period finish? When does he start to back off his carb intake if Monday and Tuesday are low training days?
Yeah, well, if Monday and Tuesday are low training days, I'd probably argue he doesn't necessarily need to go high carb in that post-training period on the Sunday afternoon anyway. Okay. Because he's got until whenever the next hard training session is to recover that carbohydrate. And if that's 2 or 3 days, then probably just your normal eating and drinking is going to get you there without having to be too aggressive or deliberate about it. Now, obviously, if you were backing up, 2 hard days in a row, that's obviously a different story, because then you've got a smaller window, I guess, to restore that carbohydrate before you've got to go out there and do it again.
Yeah.
So it's more about, I guess, that window until the next session, I guess, will dictate how important that is, or how aggressive you need to go with the post-exercise intake.
Well, that's interesting, because a lot of the runners, even in our group, will use Sunday afternoon as a bit of get it like a cheating sort of day. It's like, I've done my long run, I can just do whatever I want. The Savo, we'll go out for a big breakfast, and then we might have pizza and beers and that kind of thing, just because you feel like you're filling the hole.
Mm.
That's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the way I describe it to people is, imagine you're going on a road trip. Let's say you're driving from Melbourne to Adelaide. There's no point rocking up to Adelaide and going, right, we're here, now let's go fill up the car with all the stuff we need to bring.
Yeah.
You've got to fuel up before you're going to use the fuel, not after you hit your destination.
Interesting.
Yep. And I think the thing with that as well is, if you don't have another hard session or long session the next couple of days, then that's okay. But then if you do, then that may be where you need to get it in, and then just make sure that we're still getting in sufficient energy intake for you as well.
So where does fat fit in the mix, Steph? Is that just an extra on top to make up calories, or what?
Yeah, generally, in terms of when we tend to look at plans and work out plans, then we'd normally prioritize making sure we've got, your protein hits, etc., and then periodize the carbohydrate depending on what their training is. And then what we'd tend to do is then look at, okay, well, what's then left over in terms of energy intake, and then that can generally be coming from the fats, and prioritizing that to be obviously coming more so where we can from, your healthy fats. That's talking about an individual that is following that way of eating. Obviously, you've got some people that prefer, a higher fat way of eating, and then we may do that differently. But yeah, generally it's kind of a bit of that left over.
Yeah. Okay. So next question. We have cross-country races that are held in the afternoons here, and I've suffered this myself, what to eat in the morning, and then having a bad experience during the race because of getting the breakfast wrong. So how do you sort of strategize your nutrition for a race that starts in the early arvo?
Yep. So yeah, if it's more running based, what I tend to do is again, some people are going to be a bit more gut sensitive than others, but generally, I guess we're all a bit nervous when we've got a race or a bit excited. So what you tend to do is I'd think about, okay, well, what time is my race? If it's let's say it's 2:00, then I'd probably have a more carbohydrate, more substantial meal at potentially 11:00. So then you've got at least a few hours for that to digest and be absorbed. And I'd actually also make sure that meal is lower in fibre and not too rich in protein, because those nutrients just make it harder to break down and digest.
Can you just throw a few examples out?
Yeah. Yep, exactly. So what I do is I'd do something like a couple of white bread sandwiches as an example, not whole grain or grainy foods, and maybe a bit of ham and salad, but not, a monumental amount of salad and veggies. It might be a couple of wraps, or it might be a large wrap and more liquid-based nutrition. So it might be a large wrap and a sports drink even, or a glass of cordial. So it's just really easy to digest. Or it might be, if you do pasta, if people like pasta, it's more tomato based, and I wouldn't have a whole heap of minced meat in it because then that's again protein, and we don't load up a whole heap of cheese and creamy stuff in there because it's harder to digest. or a lot of people actually find rice is pretty easy to digest. So it might be as simple as a mince or chicken rice stir fry. Again, not loaded up with a lot of veggies. So yeah, I'd kind of start my breakfast might be something like as simple as some cereal with some fruit, or a few pieces of toast with like jam or Vegemite and a bit of sports drink. Then I might have a mid snack if I've got enough time, and it might be a banana or something. It kind of depends when you get up in the morning too. And then I'd make sure as well, like the night before, depending on what the event is, just probably also have that a bit carb rich as well. So it might be as simple as a pasta bog dish or something.
Yep. Well, we'll move on to your specialty, Alan. Electrolytes, hydration, that stuff, the ambiguous stuff. So we got Melbourne Marathon coming up. It's going to be in December. There is a chance it will be hot. It could be quite hot. We've actually had a lot of questions in the store, like what should I be focusing on? How do I get my electrolytes in? So let's say we wake up 25, 30 degrees, race morning. How does an athlete know how many electrolytes they need to take throughout that run? And how do they ratio it compared to how much water they drink? Is there something that they can follow?
Not at the moment, there isn't. There is currently zero guidelines on electrolyte replacement, which is kind of ironic because there's, a whole industry set up around sweat testing and measuring people's electrolyte losses, and then providing drinks with all different amounts of electrolytes to replace it. You've got tablets, you've got capsules and all sorts of things. But the reality is there is no current guidelines on electrolyte replacement. So it's one of the things that I think most sports dietitians early in their career, they're like, oh, great, there's all this sweat testing stuff. And they go out and do this sweat test and they get a result. And then they're like, and now what do we do with it? We know how much electrolytes they lose, but how much should we replace? And currently there isn't any good research on that. It's an area I'm sort of actively working in at the moment. What I can say from the stuff I've done so far is that electrolyte replacement is very much tied to water replacement. In other words, if you're drinking a lot of water, then you're going to need more electrolytes. If you're drinking not much water, you need less electrolytes. So I think in the past, people have kind of said, well, I lose, 500 milligrams an hour of sodium, let's just say, so I should replace 500 milligrams. And they've kind of completely uncoupled the electrolyte replacement from the water replacement. But the reality is that the two interact in the body. And so if you decouple them, you're starting to potentially run into trouble. So I guess all I can say at this stage is probably the more aggressively you're able to replace your fluid, the more focus you need on electrolytes. If you're a front runner in a marathon, it doesn't matter how good you are at grabbing cups or bottles and drinking. You're just going too fast to be able to consume probably even 50% of what your sweat rate is. So you might be sweating out a couple of litres an hour if you're a sub 3 hour runner. There's no way you're going to be able to drink more than a litre of an hour running at that pace. So in that situation, I'd probably suggest you actually need virtually no sodium at all, because essentially your blood sodium concentration is going to go up from the dehydration that you're experiencing. It's only when you, maybe the back markers who are got much more access to fluid, much more opportunities to drink it, they're going to tolerate it, they can actually swallow it without choking, they might slow down or walk through aid stations and things where there's a risk that they'll actually potentially even overconsume water, but they're going to get closer to complete fluid replacement, and that's when you actually need more sodium. In terms of exactly how much, hard to say for sure, but we know it's certainly not 100%. It'll vary from person to person, but from anywhere from 20% up to maybe about 75% of your losses replaced. But unfortunately, I can't put a number on it.
Yeah, so it is difficult to take water on during a marathon, especially if you've only got the cups as your option. And so it's perhaps best not to stress too much about it than the electrolyte component on race day.
Totally. And I guess I went into my PhD in this kind of area with this question of, should we test and target replace sodium, or should we just what I call season to taste? In other words, use sodium as, it's a balance for the sweetness of the drinks and the gels and things like that. And so you're doing it from a flavour perspective to make things a bit more pleasant for you as much as anything. And I think in that scenario that you just described, season to taste is probably the best approach.
Yeah, good. I think I had someone, I can't remember who it was, but I got a message. Someone had advised that on the body weight loss or water loss, fluid loss percentages and how that degrades performance. But I always remember you telling me that Gebre Selassie lost 10% of his body weight, Steph, when he ran the world record.
Yep.
So can you just, has anything changed in your opinion around that?
It's an interesting one. There's probably a couple of parts to this. One is that almost all the studies ever done on hydration are not blinded. In other words, you do 2 trials and one of them you're drinking lots of fluid and one you're not drinking any fluid. And it's pretty obvious, you know whether you're drinking fluid or not. So, there's quite likely a placebo effect in that because you know whether you're drinking or not. There is a researcher, we actually had him on our podcast, one of the episode that was coupled with your one actually, Lewis James from Loughborough University, and he's done a couple of studies where they've actually used nasogastric tubes to put water in, and so that people don't know whether they're getting water or not. And it does make a difference still. So even if you don't know whether you're hydrated or not, you're better off being hydrated. So I think there's definitely, the 2% is probably still the best guideline we have. It's probably not perfect, and as Lewis described, if you look at the individuals within the studies that he's done, some people can tolerate a 5% body mass loss and not change performance, whereas other people, they get to a bit more than 1% and all of a sudden their performance is dropping off. So it's probably quite individual as well how you respond to that sort of fluid loss. But yeah, unfortunately we don't have much more than that at this stage. Okay, good. Well, next one. Steph, we're getting into your zone now.
Mm.
What's the typical guide for fueling during an ultra marathon?
Yeah.
And are there any differences for the front of the back to the back of the pack runners?
Yeah. So the typical guide for ultra marathon is what we'd say it is different to like your marathon distance and your half marathon distance. Obviously we're going at a lower intensity generally, like it will still, change up and down. And then the other thing that's super common in particularly in ultra endurance events is gastrointestinal symptoms. Because generally the longer that we're exercising, the slower that our gut is able to function, digest and absorb. So we think at the moment in terms of research, we've got these guidelines that potentially for females, we may be kind of at 0.8 grams per kilo of their body mass is kind of a target of what we may aim for per hour. And then for males, it may sit at about 1 gram per kilo of body mass per hour. So that may be like a potential target for them. But again, what we do is I'd work out, well, what are they actually currently doing? And then work out, well, what is the pace and what's their aim for the event? And then work potentially towards what that goal is. And so let's say you've got like a 60 kilo athlete, and let's say the female. So we may be working towards 50 grams of carbohydrate for them per hour. But I'm not going to actually have that in a bolus, just like in your marathon as well. What we want to do is have that nice and small and frequent if we can. So I would cut that up into every 15 to 20 minutes of trying to get that carbohydrate in, and then along with a bit of fluid. And that is actually also going to be better for your gut to tolerate, because your gut then has a bit more time to kind of break it down, digest and absorb. And in terms of, is it different for a front, runner or a back of the pack runner? Yeah, for sure. So, if you're at the front, you are going to be generally burning more carbohydrate because your intensity is going to be higher. Your fitness level is better. So yeah, I'd probably be going a bit more towards a higher amount of carbohydrate than a back of the pack. And then just working with that person, like what is their actual goal? Is it just to go out and enjoy? And they're going to be doing a lot more walking, then my carbohydrate intake goal is going to be less.
Good. Okay. The fun one, and probably the biggest surprise when Steph, you wrote my marathon carb load program or diet, was the total volume here. This was the biggest shock to me. I thought I had been doing it right until I saw what you had written me, and then I was like, this is going to change everybody, because I was doing more than other people that I knew, and I was doing I was eating half as much as I should have. So I want to run through the carb load. Let's start with your guidelines on carb load. We'll start with you, Alan. How far out do we start carb loading, and what are the key principles of a good carb load?
Make sure you agree with me, Al.
Yeah, I know what Steph says, so let's compare.
Yeah. So in terms of how far out you start, people used to talk about 3-4 days. Nowadays we tend to talk about sort of 1 to 2. I tend to go sort of 1.5-ish. And what I'll often do now actually is just to make sure people are comfortable the night before a race, assuming it's a early morning start, is actually kind of stop the loading per se at sort of afternoon tea time the night before, the afternoon before, and then go back to kind of a normal sized dinner, because you've kind of done the hard work then. Because when you eat carbohydrate, the excess that you don't need immediately is stored into your muscles, and it doesn't come out again until you actually use those muscles. So as long as you're not going out and running the day before, you're not going to use it up. In terms of how much, we're talking about between 8 and 12 grams of carbs for every kilo of your body weight in a 24-hour period leading into the race, and then obviously depending on how many 24-hour periods you choose to do. That, once you translate it into food, is extraordinarily difficult, and this is where the choice of food becomes really important. So some people just say, okay, I'll just have a big pasta meal the night before. And I say to them, okay, well, you're 8 to 12 grams per kilo. That means you need probably 600-700 grams of carbs in that 24 hours. Well, your big bowl of pasta is giving you the first 100. Where's the other 600 coming from? And that's when they kind of go, oh, okay, there's a bit more to it, just as you described. So I guess in terms of some tips on how to make that easier, the first thing would be to minimise the things that aren't going to get you to carb loaded that come from your food that are going to fill you up. Because when you're eating that volume of food, and you might have experienced this yourself, Jules, did you feel like you were sort of pouring concrete into your stomach come 4 in the afternoon?
Yeah, it was just a lot of sickening kind of, because you're putting so much, like you said, solids down.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, carbohydrate by definition is starch and sugar. So the most compact sources are going to be sugar, but then you're just having all this sickly sweet stuff potentially. So that makes it challenging as well. So I guess the first thing would be to minimize sort of the fiber, the fat content, to some extent the protein content as well. Like, this doesn't need to be a high protein day. And so if you think about, like, lunchtime might be, as Steph described earlier, rice and chicken or something like that. The chicken portion is really just there for flavor. You don't really need it there. And so it's about maximizing the rice portion and minimizing the chicken portion. In terms of, fiber, this is a time to go for white bread, white pasta, white rice, rather than wholemeal or brown rice or whatever, just because you're never going to get that volume in. And if you think about it, if you're eating double the amount of carbs and it's low fiber carbs, you're probably going to get the same amount of fiber just because you're eating more of it by the time you add it all up. And then the second thing I'd really emphasize is using fluids to get your carbs in, because, if you're going to be drinking water anyway, if you're not getting carbs in the liquid, then you're going to have to drink that fluid and then eat food that has the carbs as well. Why don't you get them both in the one package? It makes life so much easier in terms of the total volume. So
when it hits your stomach, a can of Coke is not a great deal different to a packet of lollies, if that's a similar amount of sugar.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's all going to digest down, even the starch from rice or bread or pasta or something like that. By the time it gets down to your small intestine, it's all broken down into sugar, and then absorbed into you know, through your gut. So, yeah, it doesn't really matter what it starts out as. It's whatever's easiest to get into. I mean, I would tend not to use something like Coke or lemonade or something like that. One, that the fizz, like if you're having a big volume, that's not going to be too comfortable, and also just the sweetness of it. What I tend to use these days is actually just buy like plain maltodextrin, which is sort of the base ingredient in most gels, in some sports drinks as well. And it's basically a type of carbohydrate that almost behaves like sugar in terms of dissolving in liquids, but it has no sweet taste to it. It almost tastes like nothing, really. And so you can put heaps of that into like just a water bottle. You can add, you know, some people might add an electrolyte tablet for flavour, or just a squeeze of lemon juice or a drop of cordial or something. And then you can just sip on that between sort of breakfast and lunch, and then another one between lunch and dinner, and then maybe have one with dinner. And all of a sudden you've got, you know, 250 grams of carbs in without having to really feel like you've, you know, eaten out your fridge. We did a podcast on this with a mountain biker, Karen Hill, and we go through this in a lot of detail. So if anyone's interested in the nitty-gritties of this, I'd suggest going to have a listen to that one. I think it's 9B, our episode off the top of my head. And she actually got to the point where I'd refined it so much for her, because she was a client of mine, that she was actually complaining that she was hungry while she was carb loading, which I'd never heard in my life, and obviously very different to the experience that you had.
Yeah, well, that is, I mean, that's pretty handy if she can get. Is there an upper limit to that, 12 grams? Above that, is it useless?
Potentially. I mean, the bigger you are, or the more muscle you have, theoretically, the more carbohydrate you can store. But then it is in grams per kilo of body weight, so it should scale to body weight anyway. So yeah, I don't think there's a lot of point going much above that.
Yeah, I think it's only like sometimes the Tour de France guys, right? Like, because they're like stage after stage after stage. That's where they, you know, can potentially, some of them are hitting like 15 grams of kilo per body mass, but again, lighter body weight too.
Yeah, but also they're in a situation where like they've got the 4 or 5 hour stage today, and then they've got another 4 or 5 hour stage tomorrow. So they're consuming a bucket load of carbs during the stage. And then they're almost like carb loading within a shortened time frame that afternoon and evening for the next day's stage. And so you almost got 2 back-to-back carb loads joined together. So you're right. I mean, they can hit 18 grams per kilo, but a lot of that is from the first stage rather than preparation for the next one.
Yeah.
And in Ballarat, we have Steve Monaghetti, who swore by the depletion super compensation type theory for carb loading. He tells a story about being out at a restaurant and just ordering a steak, trying to order a steak with no potatoes, and about how cranky he got and how hungry he got in the days leading in, and then loading up heavy. How much merit is there in that sort of strategy?
Well, when we spoke to Jose, who was on, which episode number was that? You're good with episode numbers.
9A, I think.
9A. There we go.
Karen.
Yep. Yeah. Beautiful. Like I actually asked him that because I know like other elite level marathoners do it as well as not, you know, recreational will do it too. And it was that Scandinavian model that, I mean, that's how carb loading was kind of first known. They did that depletion phase for a few days and then loaded. But yeah, Jose was like, yeah, there's no kind of extra benefit of doing that to what we know at the moment. So yeah, maybe Steve found it beneficial because he, I don't know, felt so terrible and then you feel so bloody good after. So maybe there's a psychology perspective of that. Yeah, and I think like the important thing is just make sure that when you are doing that loading period, we say 24 to 36 hours is sufficient, going along with a good exercise taper. Often athletes are not so great with their exercise taper, so that may be where you need to bump it up a little bit more if they're not tapering. But I mean, yeah, they should be tapering.
Yeah, you'd hope so.
You'd hope so.
Yeah. All right, good one. Now, the during race nutrition, probably the other most what we're all most interested in. I guess we'll start off with guidelines again. You touched on it with the ultra marathoner, Steph. As we move down to the marathon, do we need less or more carbs? What is the upper limit for an athlete in terms of carb intake?
Yep. Do you want me to go, Al, or you want?
I'm happy to go if you want.
Yep, whatever.
Yeah. All right.
Yep.
So, I mean, the guidelines around this changed about 15 years ago to kind of suggest, up to sort of 90 grams an hour of carbohydrate is possible. The thing to remember, I guess, with a marathon, I mean, there's the shorter duration, but also the higher pace that you're running at. So theoretically, you should be using more, you're burning through more grams of carbs per minute or per hour of running compared to an ultra. And so what you tend to see if you get someone in the lab and you measure how much carbs they're using per minute or per hour, at sort of race pace, it's always going to be higher than what you can possibly consume during exercise. Mm-hmm. And particularly in the marathon, we talked about it with fluid earlier, like it's just so much harder to chew, swallow, tolerate that volume because of the intensity that you're running at and the amount that your gut's bouncing up and down as well. So, I mean, that guideline of 90 grams per hour obviously came out of lab research, primarily in cyclists. And it does get used in professional cycling. Some people can even push that higher again. But what we tend to see over and over again is just that amount for the vast majority of people just doesn't work in running, either because they don't tolerate it from a gut point of view, or they can't physically access 90 grams of carbs, like along a course, or they just don't have the opportunities to drink or eat that amount of carbs without choking on it or having to stop running, which obviously if you're at the competitive end of the field is not an option. We actually spoke to Andy Jones about this for the Breaking 2 project, and he said that they aimed for about 70 grams an hour, and obviously they were able to increase the access to carbohydrate because they could feed them off the bike as regularly as they wanted. So they weren't limited to stationary aid stations every 5K along the course. And even then, he said they didn't get through that whole 70 grams an hour. So it was probably somewhere between 60 and 70 grams per hour was about what they managed. So I think in a marathon, it's not so much about what you actually need. It's more so about what you're actually practically going to be able to achieve.
Yep.
So I think if you're going for somewhere around that sort of 50 to 60 grams an hour, you're probably doing pretty well in most cases. And if you're just doing it to finish, you're doing it for charity, something like that, and you sort of 4.5 hours plus, probably only about 20 to 30 grams an hour is enough to get you through, and it's more there to be protective of your gut as much as it is to fuel the exercise.
So a gel an hour almost for that sort of athlete.
Yeah.
Yep. And with that gel an hour, try and make sure you start off that early if you can, because we know that when you consume the carbohydrate, it could take anywhere from 45 to 60 minutes or so for it to actually get to your muscles. So we always get kind of this hit when we initially take something because of our brain, our receptors. So we feel good when we put carbohydrate in our mouth, but for it to actually be used for the muscles, it takes time. So Alan and I would always usually say start earlier rather than later. And what we'll often say is back it off near the end, like in your last 30 minutes or so, or of your marathon. And if you just can't, stomach things, don't worry about it, or just swish some carbohydrates, spit it out if you want. You'll still get a benefit. But yeah, don't just listen to the gels that you see, because often you'll see in all of them, take it 45 minutes into it, but that's a bit too general.
And there was a bit of a war on fructose for a while, wasn't there? We had a lot of products coming out saying no fructose, and that was their selling point. Is that something to avoid?
So fructose, I guess, has been, obviously a bit maligned, probably more from the health point of view rather than the performance aspect. With the way that carbohydrates absorbed from our gut during exercise, there's kind of two mechanisms. So basically all the carbohydrate we eat will digest down into one of three sugars. So glucose, fructose, and what's called galactose, which is one half of lactose. So it only really comes in dairy products, so it's probably not relevant during exercise. So it's primarily glucose and fructose, and there's I guess a ceiling or a limit to how much you can get out of your gut and into the bloodstream, per minute or per hour. And for glucose, it's thought to be around 60 grams an hour. And then fructose can kind of be additive. So if you're going much above 60 grams an hour of carbs during exercise, actually the fructose is required because you need that to be absorbed through the other channel in the gut wall. I guess the other thing that people might talk about, and maybe you can add to this, Steph, is the potential malabsorption of fructose and then causing gut issues, because it is technically what we call a FODMAP. But generally speaking, if people are having that alongside glucose, it's reasonably well tolerated for the most part, and it's some of the other FODMAPs that are often causing issues. I don't know if you want to add to that, Steph.
Yeah. No, you said that well. I think, exactly that. If someone is trying to get more than 60 grams of carbs an hour, which some people will, then that's where you do want to potentially look at the fructose, particularly if you're going more than 70 grams of carbs an hour. And that's why you will see that in your gels, that there'll be glucose and fructose, because they're kind of marketed generally to that. But there's definitely heaps of gels that are just glucose or maltodextrin based because, for a number of reasons, because they know it might cause a gut issue, and also maltodextrin based because it's less sweet. And then, some people do have problems with absorbing fructose because it's absorbed a lot more slowly. So if you are someone that is at more of an increased risk of gut symptoms, then that may be something that you want to be more careful of.
Yep. Okay, cool. All right, so last one, post-run refuel strategy. Was there a recent little study that I saw that came out, something around it's only relevant for carbohydrate, that 15-minute window, was it, post-run, where you need to get something in the first 15 minutes, and protein you can refuel within a couple of hours or something. Anyway, forget that. But what's your what's your rules for post run?
Yep. It will. I know you hate that depending answer, so you didn't give me a specific situation there. So,
all right. Okay. Sunday long run, 2 hours in the bush. So here you go. 2 hours in the bush. It's a hard run.
Thank you. And then, do you have another important session? How long away?
Wednesday morning.
Wednesday. And when's that long run in the bush? What day's that?
Sunday morning, Sunday, but we also running every day.
Okay, good. Thank you. That's all I need. So, all right, I would try and be proactive in your recovery nutrition, if you can. I think it also just puts good habits in there for you. So, if we wait too long, we're more likely to get tempted with, I guess, less ideal choices, or we might forget about it. So generally, if we can get something in soon after, our muscles are the most receptive, particularly to carbohydrates soon after exercise. So it will just be able to absorb and take it on really well soon after. If I was having another hard session, like particularly in multi-stage racing, then if it's less than 8 hours between another hard event, then I'm going to be like even more proactive in getting something in. So I would try and get in some really easy to digest carbs to start with. And I generally try and potentially, if you've done a decent run and your gut's not all that settled, just try and do small and frequent intake if you can, because your gut may not be able to tolerate a whole heap, straight after. So even if you made that into liquid nutrition, it might be a fruit smoothie or something, and you can just sip on that. Might even be on the way home if you've got a long trek back. And I'd also try and get in some protein for sure, because that's going to help with your muscle repair, tissue repairing, and your recovery. So generally about 20 to 30 grams as general advice of a protein hit. And again, if you had like a large fruit smoothie, so you've got 500, 600 mils of milk in there and maybe even some yogurt, you've got your 20 to 30 gram hit in there. And then you've also got fluid and electrolytes in there as well. So you'll retain that fluid really well because you've got the nutrients in there. So post run, I'd always be thinking about getting in some hydration, so rehydrating, and then repair, so that's the protein aspect, refueling the carbohydrate bit, and then small and frequent just from the gut bit, and then from immune health, get in some of those carbs, and then when you can, get in a bit of fruit and veg as well, and that will just get your vitamins and minerals in. But yeah, then if I've got another hard run 8 hours later, I'm kind of doing that, like continuing to get in carbohydrate to make sure then I'm ready for the next run.
Okay. Anything you'd like to add to that strategy, Alan?
No, I think Steph's covered that off nicely with what we call the R's, the 5 R's of recovery. So, yeah, I think it's fine.
All right. I got one more question then. Melbourne Marathon's coming up this weekend. No, couple of weekends. Now, what are your 3 tips for an athlete going out there and maybe doing a marathon for the first time in terms of their fueling? We'll do 1 tip each, actually. Steph, you can get the first crack at it.
First crack. Well, my biggest tip is make sure whatever you're going to do on that race day, you've done in your training. So I really, really hope that you've practiced some of your nutrition in your training. Don't copy what your peers do, please. Like make sure you practice on yourself, because we are all individual. And I'd say just small and frequent intake if you can, and be mindful, generally drink to thirst, even if it's a hot day, generally drink to thirst.
All right. She's taken 3 tips, Alan.
Sorry.
I hope you've got one left.
Yeah, well, I think they were kind of all 3. The only thing I would add potentially to that, and it's kind of an extension of what Steph said rather than anything different, is think about, do you know what products they're providing on course in terms of aid stations?
SIS.
Okay. So if you can get hands on some SIS between now and then, so not only practice the quantities, but practice with the exact products that you're going to have on course.
Yep.
So you don't get any nasty surprises on the day. You don't want to get there and pick up the first cup, have this grand plan to get all your carbs from sports drink provided on the course. You take a sip and you spit it out and you can't tolerate it. And then you're going to break down in tears because your whole plan's just gone out the window.
Actually, that was a tip also from just thinking about Andy, and something he learned from Louise too is, all athletes are different, so their tastes are different as well. So you really do need to make sure that you like what you take.
Yep. Yeah, I thought that too, and even just wake the senses up a little bit with a different flavour.
Surprise. Yeah.
Just keep yourself like a little bit entertained almost.
I can just see Louise at an aid station like sneaking some menthol into a drink at the 30k mark, and someone's chugging it down and gets this massive hit of cold menthol in the mouth or something.
Or something bitter. Yeah.
Wake up.
They should change that flavour because no one actually likes menthol. And I know it's such a big thing for like you guys in the labs. You love menthol so much, but no athlete likes menthol. I'm giving it a tip.
You don't like that minty fresh taste?
No, not on course. Only when I brush my teeth.
Yeah, fair enough.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. Again, one more shout out to the Long Munch. You're on every platform, aren't you?
Pretty much, yeah. Certainly all the major ones. And because it's our 1 year anniversary, our next, well, maybe by the time this is released, it'll be out. Our next podcast after the Breaking 2 one is a 1 year summary where Steph and I recorded it the other day. We've gone through and done like a 2-minute summary of every topic that we've covered over the year. So if you want to not have to play everything back at 3 times speed and find out all the information, just listen to that one and you'll get a summary of every topic.
Yeah, cool. I'm a rambler, as you know, so Alan's is like real nice and succinct, and mine is a bit more rambled, but Alan's done a really good job of editing me out in too many rambles, I thought.
Well, I'll let Brady edit out today's episode.
Yeah, but thanks also to you, Jules, because you really helped inspire us with the Long Munch and gave us some really good tips in terms of just how we actually construct the episodes with an actual question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you guys, and go check out the Long Munch.
Awesome. Thank you.
See ya.